And I can remember, I could just remember.
Yesterday's Witness.
I'll never forget this. It was the most extraordinary scene.
A series which explores living memory.
Some of my memories go back to
the situation in those days.
I think looking back,
I remember. I was there.
At the end of the last century, the atmosphere began to be torn apart by man-made electrical disturbances.
Hello, CQ. Hello. Ash, hello. Wave your hand if it's all okay. No waves? No waves at all. Curse. Kirk, is that all right in there? Kirk!
The hotel was old-fashioned, and the sitting room Ashenbury.
By 1922, the first crude Morse signals had changed to broadcasting as we know it today, and this was largely due to the enterprise of devoted amateurs. Marconi himself began as a kitchen table experimenter, applying the scientific knowledge of the day to make a practical means of telegraphy without wires. In 1896, aged 22, he came from his native Italy to show his invention to the English, who were greatly impressed. Soon he had his own company, which R.D. Bangay joined in 1903.
We were regarded by the general public as magicians, something kind of supernatural, but I think we rather kind of rolled in that. It amused us. I don't think we were any different then to what one is now. It was a question of the problems you had to meet and the difficulties of communication of any kind. Motor cars in the earliest days were unknown, and to get from one point in England to another was quite a problem sometimes.
Mr. Bangay went to work at the experimental station at Glace Bay, Nova Scotia. The station was for developing better equipment and for transmitting news bulletins to ships at sea.
The station was not a very comfortable one to live in. It was on the top of a sand dune, 100 feet high, with nothing but the Atlantic Ocean in front of you.
He also worked at the Cape Cod transmitter in Massachusetts. One day, they had a visitor there.
It wasn't a local man, it was a man who came down from Boston. I think he was a medical officer of some kind, and because the station was surrounded by barbed wire fencing, and nobody was allowed in it. However, he came to the front door and asked whether he could have a look around and be shown the transmitters and things. And I asked him what his purpose was. And he calmly told me that he was writing a thesis on the effect of electrical waves on the brain, on the human brain, which he said the electric waves softened the brain. So we found him out of the transmitter house and everything else.
In 1906, the Russian Navy ordered wireless, and Mr. Bangay helped install it.
They wanted to use the stations for communicating with their ships and to keep an eye on possible revolutionaries.
He completed a transmitter, sent a signing-off message, and returned to the Russian base.
And when I arrived there, the first thing that happened was that I was arrested. And then I found that later that I was arrested for having started a revolution, because one of the officers had picked up my message to Franklin saying I'd be ready the next morning at 9:30, and that happened to be the very hour when a mutiny took place on one of their battleships, the Krasny Gorka. And they thought that I had been mixed up in arranging for the revolution.
John Scott Taggart heard of wireless through the great news stories of the day.
My first interest was probably aroused by the famous Crippen incident, when Dr. Crippen was arrested as a result of a wireless message. Of course, that created great public interest.
Dr. Crippen murdered his wife in 1910. He escaped by ship with his mistress, Ethel Leneve, but they were caught as a result of wireless messages. 2 years later, wireless was again in the news.
Next time, I suppose, would be the sinking of the Titanic, because immediately after that, I certainly had started experimenting. I think the main thing that attracted me to wireless as a hobby way back in 1912 was the fact that you could communicate. It was a real working hobby. You were doing what commercial people were doing. You were doing what ships were doing. You were doing what Marconi was doing.
In 1913, the Volturno, a British ship loaded with Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, caught fire in mid-Atlantic. She carried wireless and sent out an SOS. John Scott Taggart was listening in.
160 people lost their lives, but 600 were saved, and that was done entirely by wireless as a result of wireless calls. And the last message which the operator sent was, "For God's sake, can't anybody come and help us?" Well, 10 ships went to help them. And I got all the messages in connection with the Volturno. I knew all the names of the people who were rescued and survivors' own stories that were sent by wireless to the British newspapers and so on. It was a tremendous boost for ship wireless communication. And of course it was very exciting for a boy of 16.
The Marconi Company had mainly been concerned with marine wireless, but in 1912, the military authorities asked them to equip a Flanders monoplane.
Well, it was a fine experience on the ground, but I wasn't looking forward to the test, because every time one of their aeroplanes went up, something broke to pieces on landing. Actually, it was the first time that communication had been made between the air and the ground in England. I believe an earlier communication had been made in America by the Wright brothers. But I was the first in England, in a way.
Details of the new science appeared in a number of publications, particularly in hobby papers and boys' books. Eric Payne was also destined for the Marconi Company.
My first contact came with wireless by an article which appeared in the Book of Knowledge, which was a very high-class monthly publication. It was subscribed to by all the best families. It was edited by Arthur Mee. Well, in June of 1911, there appeared an article. It was entitled "The Unseen Telegraph Messenger," and it described in considerable detail a wireless transmitter and receiver in those days.
He followed the instructions, and the outfit worked. His new obsession was shared by a neighbour, the vicar of Stoke-by-Nayland.
Canon Wilkinson first used the church tower to support his aerial, but I think some of the parishioners took rather a poor view of this. So in his own garden in the vicarage, he constructed a very wonderful mast, quite 100 feet high, and in those days he was meticulous about the joints. He contended that the joints should be soldered. He called it solder because in the days of King Solomon's temple, the Bible refers to the solderers who helped to make the metal for the temple. And Canon Wilkinson insisted on soldering these joints up at the top. So he got himself hauled up the mast by his family with the blow lamp heating the soldering iron in a bathtub. He hauled us right up to the top and did his joints. And he admitted afterwards he was crying with fear because of the height and the risks.
In Germany, the military authorities had been taking a sinister interest in wireless developments. Kenneth Alford found out why.
I was listening to the broadcast in German from Nauen, near the outskirts of Berlin, and I noticed that he was sending out one particular sentence, time after time. Krieg ist erklärt gegen Russland und Frankreich. War is declared against France and Russia. This poignant message from Berlin is probably the most exciting message I've ever taken. And we go to the log and we see August 2nd, 1914, European war broke out. A series of calls received and a blank space showing that the post office had impounded the whole equipment. And that closes the book.
Another young man had decided his future before the 1418 war over a meal in a turnip field. His name was J.N. Cragg.
The meal itself consisted of the usual bread and jam or a warmed up tea, and wrapped in the jam sandwiches wrapped in a paper, which was actually a page or two of Tidbits, a periodical that used to be very much read at that time. And there was an article in there about wireless and the world at your feet. It was headed by the world at your feet. See the world. And that struck me as something that inspired me right away. I thought to myself, that's me. Better than this job of getting wet up to the backside amongst cutting turnips.
But now it was war, and he found himself aboard a sitting target for the new German weapon, the U-boat.
I had with me not a junior operator as company, but there's a grey parrot which I bought in a place called Facardus. Anyway, we had about 500 so-called sky pilots, as we call them, missionaries, coming home from the West Coast at the time, when suddenly one afternoon, without any warning whatsoever, the ship gave a shudder, and followed by a screaming and shouting from everybody on board nearly. And I said, my God, something must have happened. Then the ship rolled over about 30 or 40 degrees angle. And the concussion of the explosion released all the main equipment out of the silence cabin. It banged against the door, and the door flew open, the stuff flew out on the floor.
He reassembled his wireless and went to the captain for the ship's position.
So he wrote it out, the difficulty, handshaking. And well do I remember sending out the SOS in that position. And at the same time, having on my shoulder Polly sitting comfortably pecking the lobe of my ear while I was transmitting. And I said, well, it says something for a parrot, because the only cool-headed person I could vision on the ship.
An American destroyer came within the hour, and the ship limped safely back to port. The war was going badly, and the army needed better wireless. They were now using valves, which made speech transmission possible. One of the first people to speak over the air was the wife of an army officer, Mrs. Donisthorpe.
They had groups of training centres all around Worcester, about within a radius of a mile. And he had a tent just on the river bank where he had his special experiments, his own, nothing to do with the army, except that he used army staff and army personnel. And during the night, I used to have to go down there and play gramophone records and talk to my husband over the radio. And we used to say that, I remember that rhyme, a wonderful bird, the pelican, his beak holds more than his belly can. I used to say that endlessly for the radio. I don't know why. I don't know whether the vowel sounds or consonants were any help.
She later learned that a German Zeppelin out on a night cruise picked up her transmission. The crew were very surprised.
I was the first woman to speak over the radio, I think. First broadcaster. All the stations heard me all around, within the mile radius.
The Army's experience with valves passed into general circulation at the end of the war. John Scott Taggart began writing in the trenches and later went to work at the Eddiswan Valve Factory, where he made a valve for Dr. Ambrose Fleming.
He, in my opinion, although he invented the diode valve detector for the reception of wireless signals, really missed every boat that sailed. He didn't develop the valve into a 3-electrode valve. Most of that work had been done by an American, Lee DeForest, and some work by Germans. But Fleming doesn't seem to have exploited his own inventions. And it was rather surprising that after all these years, the mountain gave birth to a mouse in the form of a very simple valve used for an alarm system. This was a comparatively simple valve, and since I was in charge of manufacture, I made this valve myself with my own hands. And I took it along to Fleming, whom, of course, I revered as the great pioneer of valve work. And I was rather surprised to find him sitting there. He was now an old man, and he was almost stone deaf. And instead of having some sort of hearing aid or using an amplifier, he had the most antiquated horn fitted to his ear, and I had to shout down this like a speaking tube.
After 1918 came the golden age of the home constructor. Wireless clubs formed up and down the country, although the oldest in Derby began in 1911 and is still going strong.
Papa, oh, look what you're going to get for sixpence if you go. Is this the same one?
No.
Oh, this is another one. Sorry.
Oh.
This is a 28-volt one, isn't it?
Yes.
Right.
What's it heavy?
Same again, but 28-volt input. Can we get a shilling for this one anyway? 28, anybody got a 28-volt car?
The instinct wireless people have for pooling knowledge and helping each other came as a pleasant surprise to Colonel Arthur Hazelhurst.
In my very early days, I didn't know that anyone was interested other than myself. One doesn't until one gets just that little bit older. But during my school days, when I did find out the addresses of these people and took up enough effort to go and knock on their doors, they received me with absolute open arms, and the feeling was tremendous.
Shilling, 10 cents. 1 and 6. 1 and 6 anywhere, the works of art. I'm sorry we can't sell it to anybody under 14. Can we get 2 bob anywhere, the jelly, complete with instructions, working on ITV?
What size is it, Tom?
Derby Radio Club has a fine collection of early wireless sets, most of them still working.
1913, the only signals you would hear would be from spark transmitters. Now, a spark transmitter is a piece of equipment like that, worked with a Morse key, and the thing you would hear was a noise like this.
Until 1920, you could still only hear Morse. Gilbert White was lucky enough to go to a school where the science master was building a wireless receiver.
It was actually the first signal I'd ever heard, and it was a spark transmission. The next thing we did hear, which was more exciting, although it was it was a normal transmission, it was the Eiffel Tower, which used to come on then with time signals. Now, the idea of getting time from Paris was really wonderful. It's something out of this world.
G2CVV, G2CVV, George 2, Canada Victoria, Victoria, G2OU, George 2, Oslo United calling you. Anywhere about, Fred? G2OU standing by.
G2OU, Golf 2, Oscar Uniform, this is G2 Charlie Victor Victor, Golf 2 Charlie Victor Victor. Very good evening, Gilbert. Just check that you're reading me. Reading you 5 and 9. Go.
G2CVV, G2OU returning. Very good evening, Fred.
The first phone signal, or telephony signal, was about 12 months after. It would be round about 1920, when we used to get or try to get PCGG, which was the Dutch station. In fact, it was the only telephony station actually broadcasting anyway. And we was extremely excited when Mr. Waite invited us down on Sunday afternoon, specially to hear this transmission. And at a small point, I remember him standing there, and we had to be in dead silence. Because bear in mind, this was just a single triode, and he'd have his woodbine in his mouth with ash about 2 inches long, and he daren't even hardly touch the condenser in case he lost it.
In Guildford, Reg Patrick was using his set to raise money for charity.
Now, in those days, the Royal Surrey County Hospital in Guildford was entirely dependent on local support for its running. We set up this receiver of mine with a loudspeaker, rather a horn, something like this, in various halls in Guildford, and reproduced over this loudspeaker the new wireless. And we charged people 6pence to come in and hear the wireless, this newfangled business, and 6pence extra if they wished to tune the receiver. Of course, there was no broadcasting as we know it today, but round about the 1920s, there was a small Dutch station, PCGG, used to come up on Sunday afternoons for the benefit of wireless amateurs, and it was possible on our sets over here to hear those Sunday afternoon Dutch concerts, as they were called.
The wireless amateurs formed themselves into a powerful pressure group. They made the government agree to let Marconi send out some experimental broadcasts from Writtle, near Chelmsford. One of the broadcasters was a singer in a local amateur concert party, Winifred Sayer.
We were in a packing shed. They made, there was big cases, wooden cases and that all around. We sort of had to walk and step over them and all the different equipment to find where Mr. Ditcham was sitting with this, I don't know what you call it, all the valves and things. And he had a little table and talked into a microphone. There was a song at that time that was quite popular, and it was very short. It was called Absent. Don't ask me who wrote it, because I couldn't tell you. But I sang that. But of course we didn't have a piano. We had to start off with a tuning fork and the hum of the different things, the electrical things that were going on at the same time. I think I got 10 shillings a night. I thought it was wealth. In those days, it's a long time ago, you know.
This is actually operated from one of the very first type homemade crystal sets, which you just wound a few turns round.
Yes, I remember
I
that.
don't know whether there's, we can... The tuning arrangement was a bit crude. It sort of, you tuned it up on this slider here. Very wide band, but...
Compact and clever.
Yeah. Yes,
But of course that is fed into this speaker through this amplifier.
Oh yes, it goes
the volume
here.
from that crystal set on its own with a pair of headphones would be considerably less than that.
Oh yes, it would. And it's not very...
Marconi's next move was a milestone in broadcasting. Dame Nellie Melba broadcast a concert.
I was listening at Colchester to the Melbourne broadcast, and I remember borrowing all the headphones that I could possibly lay hands on and taking them home, connecting them up in series and letting my friends and relatives and neighbours listen. And of course they were fascinated.
But the authorities in this country, the service people, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Post Office itself were terribly afraid of interference with their ordinary communications. And the idea of broadcasting was also, well, it was anathema to me, to them. And at the time, I was a member of the Wireless Society of London Committee and was one of 3 representing the Wireless Society of London who urged, with other bodies, the introduction of regular weekly half-hour concerts from Whittle, which were conducted by Captain P.P. Eckersley, who was later the chief engineer of the BBC.
Hello, CQ. Hello, CQ. This is 2Emma Talk. Rittle testing. This is 2Emma Talk.
P.P. Eckersley was not only an engineer, he was also a brilliant mimic.
The experiments at Writtle, 2Emma Talk, as it was known, attracted a large number of amateurs. There was sufficient power from Writtle to feed the sets which couldn't receive the Dutch station, and the demand for wireless broadcasting, as we know it today, grew very rapidly.
There was now a real demand for a broadcasting service, and the government allowed 5 big wireless manufacturers to combine into the British Broadcasting Company with its call sign 2LO. Later, the company became the British Broadcasting Corporation. Reg Patrick, who began as a schoolboy with a passion for wireless and the cinema, spent all his working life at the BBC. He has a film of how that chapter began.
Thank you.